Mada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vasishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat. As promised last time when we met for the Gita about a month ago, we are to begin the study of the most important Upanishad, namely Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, this evening. Unlike the Gita, Upanishad takes us to a very high plane of thinking, feeling and experience. To that extent, it is not directly dealing with our day-to-day problems like the Gita. That is called practical Vedanta, the Gita. And what is behind that practical Vedanta is what you get in the Upanishad. Gita itself describes itself as Upanishadsu Brahmavidyayam Yoga Shastra. Yoga Shastra, practical Vedanta, coming out of the Upanishads, the Brahmavidya of the Upanishads. If Brahmavidya is true, what are the consequences? So we study the consequences, the impact of thought on life, on activity. Now we go to the source of the thought itself. What is this great philosophy, Vedanta, which has been expounded by Krishna in the Gita? This is the main theme of the Upanishads, among which this particular Upanishad is supremely significant. Shankaracharya's commentaries on these Upanishads are masterpieces of thought and language. During the study we conduct here, I shall try my best to share with you some of those great passages in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad and Shankara's scintillating comments here and there. In the beginning, it will not be so very attractive because it contains the mythology of the previous portions of the Vedas. After a few chapters, you begin to reach a new area of thought. And from that onwards, it is simply fascinating, intellectually stimulating. The Upanishads took up this great challenge of human knowledge. Ages ago, we are living in a world of advance of knowledge today. That knowledge is accepted in the Upanishads, the knowledge of the world in which you live. But the Upanishad goes one step further. What is this human mind that knows this world? What is man as subject and not merely the world as object? We study the world as object. Use the word thing. A thing in this world. Chair, table, trees, plants, clouds, all these are things. The sun and moon and stars, they are all things. We study things. That is the first study. What we call knowledge of sensory data. The data brought by the senses from the world of experience. That is the first field of knowledge for human beings. For every newborn baby, the first challenge comes from the world around it, which impinges upon the baby's mind through the five sense organs. Sense of touch, hearing, sight, etc. The baby is puzzled, full of wonder. What is the world in which I have been cast? That's why in English we say, knowledge begins with wonder. With wonder, the child begins his great advancement in knowledge. That knowledge relates to sense data, what the senses report to you. A baby may not know much, but a scientist knows much more. And all the various sciences give us much more knowledge of the external world or the sensory world than any ordinary human mind can give. That is the first study that is accepted in the Upanishads. That's why today's advancement in scientific knowledge is just the fittest setting for studying the Upanishads, because they take this investigation one step ahead, one step further. What is the world? We found the answer through science. We call it physical science. Science is not conditioned by the word physical. Science is only knowledge. Verified, verifiable knowledge. That is science. Dealing with experience. But when you add the word physical, you limit science to a particular field of investigation. That's called sense data. What the senses reveal, I process it and produce scientific knowledge. That is beautiful. But let us never forget, and today our scientists also must constantly keep in view, that knowledge is not exhausted by the adjective physical being attached to it. In fact, adjective, we say usually qualifies a noun. Actually, it limits a noun, limits the scope of the noun. Man, and you say unlimited. Black man or white man or brown man, you will limit the concept of man. Similarly, science becomes limited by adding the word physical. We call it Bhautika Shastra in our language. Bhautika. Whatever I can get through my sense experience, I classify, analyze, put questions and get answers. And we get a whole range of physical science thereby. This is wonderful. But is this the whole of experience? Certainly not. We study things in physical science, Bhautika Shastra. What about the mind that studies, the subject that studies, the observer that observes? Can't you turn your searchlight a little on that direction? That was the great challenge taken up by the Upanishads ages ago, a challenge which is on the very frontier of science today in the Western world. They have achieved so much knowledge of the external world. At that point, they also feel the gentle vibrations of another field of inquiry, the observer, man the knower, man the self. What a wonderful concept. These 400 years in Western science, not a single thought was given to this subject. Only object, object, object. That's why a concentrated attack on the problem of what the external world is has produced a crop, successive crop of scientific knowledge, which is the speciality of this modern age. But the greatest event of the modern age is this second dimension of knowledge slowly coming on the horizon of that very physical science. Scientist as observer. What is that? What is that? And today's physical science cannot brush aside this challenging question for two reasons. One is theoretical, that physical science itself takes you to that dimension of the observer. In nuclear science, the observer plays a great part according to several nuclear scientists, because by the very act of observation, nuclear phenomena can be altered. If that can be done, what is this new factor? A science should take all factors into consideration. At the molecular level, the observer plays no part in altering or changing the external phenomena. But as soon as you go to the nuclear dimension, something strange happens. The very act of observation destroys the observed data. That is something wonderful. And so, many scientists, among them Wheeler, one of the great nuclear scientists who is in Texas, and Eddington and many others, they have found a need to throw the searchlight onto the observer. What is this observer? What is his nature? We study this nature, revealed by the senses. But the observer who studies this world is also a subject of observation, a subject of inquiry and study. What shall we do with it? This is just the beginning of a slight interest in man the subject, man the observer, man the self. We had simply eliminated him from the time of Descartes in the 16th, 17th century. Let us study only the object. And we have reached wonderful conclusions thereby. But the fascinating part of the mystery of modern science today is not the mystery of the object, but the mystery of the subject. Theoretically, we cannot avoid this question, says nuclear scientists today. Practically also we cannot avoid it. Here is another great conclusion. Namely, as a result of these scientific discoveries, technological inventions, the whole world is altered. Man doesn't know where he belongs. He becomes an object, like any other objects, conditioned by these forces. He loses his own peace, his own integrity as a human being. What has happened to me in the midst of all this scientific revolution? So here you have many, many books coming out of the West from great writers that are we going towards a catastrophe? Are we going to destroy this planet? Environmental problems are serious. All these questions come. What is that in man that can avert all this? What is that in man that can make him or her strong and steady and peaceful in spite of all the various pressures coming upon him or her from modern technological developments? Now this is a practical question. You cannot postpone this subject any longer. It is in these contexts that you can see the greatness and originality of the great sages of the Upanishads who gave to humanity science of a different field of experience. The same science carried over to a different field of experience. The observer, the self. The not self is the object. The self is the subject. And today scientists are fond of these Upanishads. There is such a profound thinking. We don't call it merely a religious book, unless you use the word religion in a correct sense. A few do's and don'ts, dogmas and creeds and this and that. That doesn't make for science. You don't get any such thing in the Upanishads. It is a real scientific investigation into a realm where the ordinary sense organs cannot go. The ordinary mind, subject to the sense organs, also cannot go. A new training of the mind is needed. For any scientific research, training of the mind is essential. We call it training in scientific method, scientific attitude, scientific approach. That training is needed for any physical scientist. And the Upanishad says the same training carried a little further is needed for research into this field of experience. This is also a science of that which slowly impinges upon us at the sensory level, coming from beyond that level. The sensory level feels the pinch of some other energy impinging upon it. What is that other energy? Is there such an energy? Nobody takes things for granted. The Upanishads also, nothing is taken for granted. We do feel some impinging. We want to know what it is. That is the way scientific research is done. Some of the planets were discovered in the beginning. Some others had not been discovered in modern scientific history, I am telling. Many knew, the Jupiter and Saturn, all these we knew. But some minor planets we did not know, like Neptune or Mercury, or earlier for outer ring, some new ones, Pluto, etc. They had not known. Discovery of one of them was made by studying the same subject as I am just now telling. A new force is acting upon the other planets. All known forces cannot account for that particular deviation. Then, theoretically, the astronomer concluded somewhere in certain parts of space there must be another planet. With that influence, we can explain the behavior of this planet. That is theoretical deduction in the beginning. And next was sending the telescope up here and there. Finally, they discovered planets lying beyond the outer stretches of the, towards the outer stretches of the solar system. This is what we have seen today. And similarly, if this influence also is influencing the behavior of nuclear phenomena, then we must search for it. Somewhere it is there in experience itself. The word experience is a vast word in Vedantic terminology. Physical experience is one aspect of it, that's all. Many other dimensions are there. But a science which studies experience alone is science. If you study some imaginary something, that is not science. So the Upanishad studied experience in its other dimension, the self, dimension of the self. As we study today in physical science, the dimension of the not self. And these are all specific, clear-cut terminologies and concepts, both in the Upanishads and modern thought. Take, for example, two words used by these Upanishads to deal with the external phenomena studied by physical science and the observer or the self phenomenon studied by philosophy or Vedanta. The words are Parak Prakriti, Pratyak Prakriti. Prakriti means nature. Parak Prakriti means external nature. Parak means there, which the senses can reveal. Take Parak Prakriti, P-A-R-A-K, Parak. The other is Pratyak, inward. The finger goes towards the self. Somewhere within this is the center of that experience. Pratyak. Parak and Pratyak. Both are Prakriti. Both are nature, but two dimensions. Parak Prakriti, Pratyak Prakriti. Both are studied, which are scientific. Physical sciences deal with Parak Prakriti. And Vedanta deals with Pratyak Prakriti. And science will not conflict with science. One science doesn't conflict with another science. Even chemistry doesn't conflict with physics. It adds up to something more than physics. So also botany, then zoology. You are adding up something. Basically it is all science. We call them departments of science. They are not the whole of science. Departments of science. The scientists of today, who are strongly materialistic, they find it very difficult to accept these ideas. They are very much glued to that concept of total reality is only what the senses reveal. We call them materialistic. Material we can understand. But here is a philosophy called materialism, where knowledge is confined only to the external world. Whatever comes out of sensory observation. One word coined recently from the last century onwards to deal with this sensory limitation of scientific knowledge is called positivism. Positivistic science, we call it. Whatever is revealed by the senses, you study. Don't take anything else in view. That's called positivistic attitude. Many scientists do not want to break from this attitude. Many others are challenging that kind of limitation. Science is wider than what you and I consider to be matter. And nobody has seen matter. Not a single scientist has seen matter. We only use a particular term to deal with what we study. That's all. It's only a mere symbol. But to build a philosophy on it is most dangerous. It's already happening. Protest against this comes from scientists themselves. I remember I was addressing the University of Fiji in their capital city some years ago on my tour. After the lecture, where I referred to these ideas, there were questions. One question was from a Russian, naturally at that time was a Marxist. He said, I don't accept all these new ideas. I believe in the scientists of the 19th century, staunch materialists. I cling to it, he said. Then everybody looked how the Swami is going to answer this question. Quite a serious challenge. Then I merely said, I will give you an example given by Sir Arthur Eddington, that great astronomer and physicist of England who passed away some years ago. He said, here is a scientist studying life in the ocean, marine life. He has a net in his hand of 2 inches holes, and he casts the net into the sea, catches an assortment of material from the sea. Then he comes to his laboratory, puts them all there, classifies them, and finally concludes. And those conclusions are 2. 1, this sea doesn't contain, based upon my what you call scientific observation, this sea doesn't contain any being less than 2 inches in size. Number 1. Perfectly correct. Secondly, there is not a single animal in this sea without gills. That's also correct. Then Eddington said, whatever he has said about his catch is perfectly correct. But what about the catch itself? If he had improved that hole in the net to make it smaller and smaller and smaller, you would have got many more varieties. But our scientific method doesn't allow us. We get only these and we make conclusions about it. Therefore, I don't consider that physical science constitutes the whole world of knowledge. Eddington was telling them. As soon as I finished talking this way, all of them clapped hands. Something wonderful. Yes, that is the limitation of physical science. We may be satisfied with a thing, but from the truth point of view, there are many things unsaid in physical science. Now, when you come to the Upanishads, you come to that very terra incognita of experience, unrecognized part of experience, namely the self. And today's psychology and neurology are attacking this problem just now. We also want in Vedanta that physical science should continue its investigation. Search for that elusive reality called the mind in experience. Up to the brain, neurology has come. We have studied the brain and we have studied the living brain also. Formerly, doctors used to study only dead brains. Now we study living brains. Very great advancement is there. And all this study is directed to understand human behavior, how the nervous system functions here. All that is study going on. Along with that, to ask one question, what is the nature of man arising out of this study? Is he entirely a piece of machine? Is he merely a thing among things? Is there anything very unique in this human system? By studying this physical body, they want to find out what is the mystery behind this physical body. Now, today's neurology is attacking this problem with a tremendous effort, with some little success also. Up to the end of the last century, we had in psychology a system known as behaviorism, behavioristic psychology, purely a physical psychology. You can as well call it physiology, but that was understanding at the time. By behavior and manipulating behavior, we try to understand the human being. This is called behavioristic psychology. Originally, Professor Watson was the great psychologist. Just a few days ago, a great American behaviorist passed away. He had carried on further research and was satisfied that man is a machine which can be handled, which can be made to function in particular ways, etc., etc. And unfortunately, American education began to be influenced by this behaviorist philosophy of man. Many parents became frightened. We are treated as kings. Our children are treated as things only, to be manipulated, by this great professor. Now that is the situation in one aspect of psychology and neurology, and the other aspects conditioned by various neurologists. Those are the Montreal Neurological Institute, some in England and other places. They study the living brain and talk to the patients while operating on the brain. Imagine the condition, because the brain has no pain. You can go on cutting, you won't get any pain. And so open the brain, go on studying here and there, and then talk to the patient by communication. Through that study, Wilder Penfield, one of the great neurologists who passed away just 6 or 7 years ago, he came to this conclusion that to deal with human being merely as a machine doesn't help us to understand the various phenomena that come out of the study. You need to posit something more than the brain. Brain which is visible and tangible, which is a thing among things, behind which there is something intangible, something very subtle. We cannot explain behavior merely on the Vivekananda brain. Something non-mechanical above it must also be taken into account. What you call mind. Now, mind is not a thing that can be observed by the physical senses. It is beyond sensory observation. This was the conclusion of the great, unique neurologist who brought about revolution in modern neurology, Sir Charles Sherrington of England. He said, mind is beyond sensory verification, and it will remain so forever. From the language, you can never see the mind with any sensory system. Not only today, with all immortality, we can't do without that mind to explain these subtle phenomena taking place in the nervous system of man. Now that is why the Penfield's analysis is just the beginning. The beginning is taken from books of modern physical science, dealing with the non-physical aspects of experience. We can watch for further developments, but at the same time, let us go into that science developed in India ages ago in the Upanishads and take help from it to understand the infinite man behind man. Purusham Mahantam, that word Mahantam is a Parak, we have accepted. Pratyak is a question mark yet. Is it true? Is there such a dimension? Whenever you begin to ask that question, you come to the Upanishad straight away. Nowhere else you will get it. Nowhere else is a language. And the Upanishad itself mentions it. He says, a student asking the teacher, I am asking you about the nature of that Purusha, that human nature, which is taught in the Upanishads. Can you tell me that? He is asking. Aupadishadam Purusham. The Purusha taught in the Upanishads. Human nature as taught in the Upanishads. Other places you hear about mechanizing of the human nature. But here it is something else. So, Aupanishadam Purusham Prachamaha. I am asking you about the Purusha taught in the Upanishads. Purusha is the general word for man, this human system, human being. Shankara comments upon it. Upanishasveva vijñāyate na anyatra. Only in the Upanishads you find this subject investigated and studied. Nowhere else, nowhere else. You can search for this subject any part of the world, any literature in the world. You will never find it as a serious science as you get in the Upanishads. You can face any challenge, any questioning. In fact, all science is science because you can question, you can verify, you can also negate its truth. One of the scientific writers today tells us, verification is not a test of scientific truth, but a capacity to withstand falsification. That is the real test of scientific truth. I am trying to falsify what you say. If I don't succeed, then it is true. So, that is another language used today by one great scientist writing The Technique of Scientific Revolutions. The wonderful book is there, a similar name. Here we say, therefore, this wonderful study, which no senses can, understand or probe with, is what to make the Upanishads of supreme interest to man in this modern period. It was great at that time. It is more relevant today because we have come to the summit of physical knowledge. From there looking, everything is emptiness all round. Then we begin to question, is this all? There is nothing beyond this, all mechanical, all physical, all determined. Is there anything else? Nothing else. Then you come to a strange state of mind. Turn the Upanishads. You begin to feel, yes, there seems to be something. Let us try, let us try. It is the attitude that very much finds acceptance today in many great scientific thinkers. Their books contain statements of the Upanishads, the way of expounding the nature of the observer. Man as the observer is a profound dimension. Earlier in Western thought, there have been thinkers who gave a hint of this profound dimension. I very often quote an article in the London journal Mirror, which was then existing about 50 years ago, by the great nuclear scientist. He was quoting a passage from Pascal. Pascal was a great scientist, mystic, and also, I think, astronomer. There he says, in space, the universe engulfs me and reduces me to a pinpoint. Anybody can understand that statement? Physically speaking, we are not even a speck of dust in the vast immensity of the universe. Even the earth is only a speck of dust. That's the first sentence. In space, the universe engulfs me and reduces me to a pinpoint. The second sentence is wonderful. That is, through thought, I understand that universe, that vast universe that reduces me to a pinpoint. I am able to understand it. Man as knower, man as scientist, that profound dimension cannot be equated only with a physical body. That is one of the beautiful utterances of this. So, Louis D. Broglie, the writer of the article on the poetry of pure science, after quoting Pascal, makes a comment. That is the wonderful beauty of science. There you can see the greatness of science thereby. Now there's a wonderful hint of suggestion coming. Scientists themselves have not probed further into it, but there is something profound. It's a mystery. Let us not rush into a conclusion. There is nothing else except what I see with my five senses. That is the warning even at that time. Later on, by Eddington, another observation was made while giving a talk on the BBC. I'm telling what happened 55, 60 years ago. He asked this question, what is the truth about ourselves? And began to answer. We may be inclined to give various answers. One, we are a bit of star gone wrong. That is one answer. An astronomer will tell you today that there was the sun going around the world along with other stars, and one day another star came close to the sun. Close means not very close, just close. And that created a big gravitational pull on the sun. Much of the sun, a part of the sun went out. They became, later on, planets going around the sun. And in one of them, life appeared millions of years later. Out of that, you and I have come. So what are we? A bit of star gone wrong. Beautiful answer. What is the truth of ourselves? We are a bit of star gone wrong. First answer. Then, second answer, given by Newtonian physics up to the 19th century, and that is, we are a piece of machinery, puppets that speak and talk and laugh and die as time turns the handle beneath. Just a mechanical something we are. Second answer. Two answers he gives, Eddington. Then finally he says, but there is one elementary, inescapable answer to this question, and that is, we are that which asks the question. We are the subject and not the object. We are asking the question. What a wonderful hint is suggestion there. Man as the questioner. Nothing questions in the world. Does the table question? Sun question? Nothing. But you are questioning. That shows there is a new dimension in you. We don't know anything about it, but worth investigating. In this way, several scientists are probing into the subject. That's why, as I said, if the Upanishads have done this work wonderfully before, it is worth studying. How did they do it? What methods did they follow? What fruits have come from that study? Now, modern science started in the West, but it is international today. Science has no boundary. Knowledge has no boundary. There is no English science or French science or German science or American science. It is science. For purposes of study, you can say this American scientist discovered this and that. Like Nobel Prize is given today just now to American scientists. Beautiful. But science itself is not conditioned by any geographical, racial and other limitations. It is just knowledge, universal in scope. Consider 5,000 years ago, the ancient sages of India produced a similar science dealing with this profound dimension of nature, the Pratyak dimension of nature, exactly with the same universal dimension. Universal concepts, universal terminologies, universal relevance. Wherever there is man, this subject goes there. That is the beginning of Indian culture. The philosophy of the Upanishads gave philosophical basis to a development of culture in India. It has continued to be its great stimulus and support all these thousands of years. Today, it is extending its blessing to the rest of the world as well. A universal science, physical, a universal science, non-physical, coming together in this modern period. That is the greatness of these Upanishads, and when we study them, we feel how contemporary these teachings are. Why? Ask that question. Why a truth is contemporary, though uttered 5,000 years ago? Because it is a truth. Truth never gets old. 2 plus 2 is 4. 5,000 years ago and now also. East, West. Because it's a truth. Why truth? A truth is something that you can rediscover, recheck for yourself. A dogma cannot be. A dogma is only one-man show. This is not a one-man show. It is what is there, what is there. Just like we study the composition of water, H2O, we call it, chemistry tells you. Yes, anywhere it is the same. All over the world it is the same. Similarly, in the world above the sensory level, to develop such a science, giving the challenge, yes, test for yourself. I am telling you a truth. You can test it for yourself. You can verify it for yourself. With that challenge, Upanishad presents its own conclusions to humanity. Remember, therefore, the tremendous intellectual and spiritual dimension of these great personalities. Personally, they are nowhere in the books. You don't know what their life is, who father was, mother was, nothing you will find there. Just a person giving the truth. The truth is what we see, not a person. That's why it's not a dogma. It is a truth. A truth because you can check it, verify it. Any scientist will tell you that scientific truths are meant to be rechecked, re-verified, even falsified if you can. If they can stand all this, then they are truths. Similarly, in the world of the inner nature of man, the same challenge is given by the Upanishads. Seek for yourself. Understand for yourself. Don't take it as my saying, is the language. Don't take it as my saying. Take it what it is worth. Check it, verify it for yourself. Now such statements you will get plenty in the Upanishads. A set of dogmas and creeds is not going to be the teaching of the Upanishads. These come later. A Smriti, for example, take Manusmriti. There are some truths, there are some dogmas, some opinions, according to his own liking. We call them Smriti. There's a typical word in Sanskrit, Smriti. Based upon the Upanishads, they wanted to control human life, discipline it, gave us laws and regulations. They are called Smriti. They are not meant to be checked and verified. They are to be obeyed. And it is good for you, they will say. And if they are not suiting you, you change them, another Smriti will come. So many Smritis have come and gone, because they go on changing. But a Shruti, the other word is Shruti, that is eternal, because they contain truths which are universal, which can be experienced, which can be checked and verified by any and every person. So we have these two types of truths in Indian thinking. One is Shruti, which is eternal, permanent. Smriti, which is temporary and regional in what you call expression. This wonderful idea has been the strength of India's culture and its experiment. Shruti and Smriti. Shruti is therefore called Sanatana Dharma, eternal Dharma. Smriti is called Yuga Dharma, for a particular age, for a particular people, Yuga Dharma. Sanatana Dharma, Yuga Dharma. And it is accepted in all of literature. If there is a conflict between the Shruti and the Smriti, Smriti will go, Shruti will remain. What a wonderful idea. What bold thinkers they were. Shruti Smriti Virodhetu, Shrutireva Gariyasi. That's the statement. When there is a Virodha between Shruti and Smriti, Shruti alone will remain, not Smriti. Truth alone will remain and not a dogma. Dogma you throw away. Where will you find this courage in any part of the world? Thinkers with tremendous courage, fearlessness. When you have truth with you, you become fearless. When you have dogmas and creeds with you, you have to hide them and never allow somebody to probe into it, because the whole thing will go. That is the difficulty. All religions contain a bit of high truth and a good deal of dogma, creed, based upon individual preferences, etc. We don't criticize them. We need them. But never subordinate that to the truth aspect of your religion. Let the Smriti be subordinate to the Shruti, says India. We don't say there is no need for Smriti. Every time you create new Smriti, the Indian Constitution itself is like a Smriti. American Constitution is like a Smriti, which conditions human life in America. Our society is conditioned by Indian Constitution, that is Smriti. And you can alter it. You are amending it all the time. Yes, perfectly right, because it is of temporary application. But Shruti is perennial, eternal. It is a truth. You don't alter it under any circumstances. Water is cold, fire is hot. Is that the truth about water, the truth about fire? You don't alter them at all. Is it true with respect to the human nature? Yes, Upanishad will tell you. That is the truth we are telling you, your own nature. If one man discovers his own nature, you can also discover for yourself that same truth. Therefore, you have these two words, Sanatana Dharma, Yuga Dharma, Shruti and Smriti. And the most important thing is, Shruti is dominant in Indian culture, not Smriti. In no other society will you find Shruti as dominant. Truths of high teachings of spiritual life being dominant is only in India. The domination, I call it. Whereas other places, Smriti is dominant. That's why they become rigid. Smriti makes for rigidity. Shruti makes for continuous progress. You can go on investigating. Same truth. Because truth is never old. It is ever aging, but never old. Purana is the word in Sanskrit. Purana, we call it as ancient. Actually, its literal meaning is Pura api, Nava eveti Purana. Though old, it is ever fresh, ever new. These are ancient.